governments are hard pressed for resources. Agencies are supposed to be delivering services. They have trouble doing it on the budgets they have. And then thinking about carving out budgets, either within the agency or through legislation, to focus on innovation where the payoffs are uncertain and they're in the future is really challenging.
DOGE, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, has taken a sledgehammer to Washington, closing government agencies and leaving many federal employees unsure if they still have jobs. Will that really make government more effective? Welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast, where we bring you groundbreaking academic research in a clear and straightforward way. I'm Hal Weitzman. Today, why DOGE may end up creating a less effective and less efficient federal government. Chicago Booth's Rob Gertner says if you want innovation and greater effectiveness from government, rather than smashing things up, you should focus on incentives, funding, and management. So how could we structure things to make government agencies worth their funding? Rob Gertner, welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we're here to talk about social innovation. I'm going to declare a bias here. I have a sense, my hunch is that institutions like government, like non-profits, are not very dynamic. They're not very innovative. Is that stereotype accurate?
I think it is accurate. I think it's a hard question. It's hard to point to the data. So I think your intuitive sense is, I don't know that I can add a ton more than I have the same intuitive sense. I think I understand. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the reasons why, but it's a little hard to measure. I once tried to look at large nonprofits and try to figure out how innovative they are and started going through, filings and annual reports and those things and decided, this was probably over 5 years ago, and decided it should wait until natural language processing tools got better. So now I think it's time to go back and look at it. But the casual start seemed to really indicate, if you look at like large nonprofits' annual reports and try to think how much are new services, new things they're doing, how much do they talk about innovation? It's not a lot at all.
Okay. I guess I'm actually sort of struggling to think what innovation in government even means. How would we compare that sort of, social innovation to traditional innovation?
Well, I think just if you think about a traditional company, right, they're thinking about, they've got customers and services, things they do, the way they create value for their customers. And they're always thinking, how can we do that better? Well, how can we use technology, develop technology, new technology that can do it better? How can we come up with new services, new ways, or to expand our customer base? And, government and nonprofits could and should be thinking the exact same thing, right? They are serving a set of beneficiaries, and they should be thinking about, what are ways to do this in a new way to create new value or additional value for our beneficiaries?
Okay, but it's a puzzle because government and nonprofits are full of people who are very passionate about what they do. Many of them could be earning a lot more money elsewhere, but they're there because they really believe in the mission of the organization. You'd think they would want to do it in a more effective way, given the resources they have. Why aren't they more innovative? I mean, people, and also anybody in an organization has ideas, right, about how to do things better. So why aren't those ideas flowing into change?
Right. I think there are three problems broadly. There's incentives, there's funding, and there's managing innovation. So I think incentives are really important. And if you think about a traditional company, they're worrying every day that somebody else is going to come up with an innovative way that's going to disrupt their business and and they're going to start losing money. So there's enormous amount of market pressure for innovation. And then if somebody comes up with an idea, there's an enormous financial opportunity through entrepreneurship to create value, to become wealthy, and institutions that support it. If you think about government or nonprofits, let's take government first. In government, if you have an idea, if you're sitting in a government agency and you have an idea how to use technology to do the services better, it's first of all, the upside, how you personally benefit if it's implemented and successful. Who knows? If it fails, you could lose your job, as opposed to the entrepreneur who fails, who just raises more money for the next venture.
So you're talking about just the structure doesn't say, we will reward people for experimenting or even just for coming up with great ideas and seeing them through.
That's exactly right. And then there are all these institutional barriers to actually implement something innovative, so that if you have that idea and you're in government and you say, I don't care about the individual rewards, I'm just going to try to make it happen, then there'll be all sorts of barriers, including funding and various other things, and bureaucratic barriers that will make it not particularly likely, which will then again say, well, it's not worth really trying to make it happen. And that then, of course, affects who works in government. And so it just kind of feeds itself into a culture that ends up not being.
When you say who works in government, you mean that the people that government tends to attract are themselves not social entrepreneurs?
I think that's to some extent true. I think if you had those ideas and you think, I want to make this happen, you'd probably quit your job and become a social entrepreneur.
Right. Okay. You'd avoid government. And I should say, when you talk about private companies, you describe them, or profit maximizing companies, you just describe them as though they operate perfectly. Many of them, those companies, also struggle with incentives and innovation.
Yeah. And I think one of the things the management literature on innovation shows is that actually innovation is really hard. And that means it has to be managed in a very disciplined, intelligent way, which again creates, without the right incentives in place, without the funding in place, it makes it really challenging for these other types of institutions.
Okay, so you talked about incentives. Let's talk about the other reasons that you outlined.
So funding, I think, is really critical, and I think governments are, we tend to think federal government, but you can also think about this, and to some extent, where innovation somewhat works within government tends to be on a more local level. But governments are hard pressed for resources. Agencies are supposed to be delivering services. They have trouble doing it on the budgets they have, and then thinking about carving out budgets either within the agency or through legislation to focus on innovation where the payoffs are uncertain and they're in the future is really challenging. They just want the money to be able to provide the services they're supposed to.
So on the one hand, they always feel they're operating with limited resources, and on the other hand, that's going to make them not want to allocate a certain proportion of those resources towards innovation,
which will ideally lower the costs in the future. And then, of course, you think about horizons could be a real problem, right? Political horizons tend to be fairly short. So if the payoff from the innovation is, 5-10 years down the road, then again, the incentives to create the political capital to do that is going to
right. There's a whole load of people in Washington, the international development community, who are probably having exactly that thought right now. We'll come to that. So you talked about budgets. It also strikes me that if you're in a government agency and you're cash strapped, your main focus is in trying to increase your budget, right? Not on sort of creating more strains on it, like an innovation fund. So what's the third? You talked about three.
Third thing is management and managing innovation in the innovative process. And I think the biggest lesson from other sectors that is really challenging for government is innovation tends to work well when you can experiment, learn, and adapt. And you have this sort of cycle of developing the innovative product with users by experimenting and then adapting. And government structures make that extraordinarily difficult. Federal government rules and regulations make sort of testing actually as burdensome, often as a regulatory process to be able to get approvals to test some potential product as it would be to implement it at scale. So we find that rules and regulations and new ways of doing things tend to be done without experimentation, with just a process of people commenting on rules, then trying the best you can in hopes to implement something. And if it doesn't work as well as you hoped, there's not much you can do about it.
Okay, so you think that regulation is standing in the way of social innovation?
Yep, I do.
Okay. And you and I have talked about a thing called the Paperwork Reduction Act, which sounds like something that wouldn't reduce paperwork, and sure enough didn't.
I think actually, as opposed to some laws where they are explicitly titled in a way that's inconsistent with their real objectives, I actually think the objectives of the Paperwork Reduction Act was to reduce paperwork. But I think it sort of has had, to some extent, at least with respect to this, to have some of the opposite effect. Because it means any time, if I want to send a new form to try out to veterans in order for them to get services, a new form or some web-based, I have to go through a whole process to get approvals because of the Paperwork Reduction Act, because I can't reach out to the ultimate beneficiaries unless I get approval about the amount of paper or the equivalent that it's going to take. So I have to sort of almost describe what's going to happen before I actually do it. So that takes an enormous amount of time before you can get approval to do things.
So
like
it does actually reduce
user term.
paperwork, but it increases the number of hoops you have to jump through.
That's exactly right. And it has the opposite end effect, because the idea of paperwork reduction is to make the ultimate beneficiaries' lives easier, and it's sort of doing the exact opposite.
Carry the Two is the show that pulls back the curtain to reveal the mathematical and statistical gears that turn the world. Co-hosts Katie Woodkowski and Ian Martin bring unique perspectives from the fields of mathematics and statistics to convey how mathematical research drives the world around us. With each episode tackling a different topic, subscribe to Carry the Two, part of the award-winning University of Chicago podcast network. Okay, Rob, so in the first half we talked about, why it's so hard for government units to innovate, why it's so hard for non-profits as well, but we were talking more about government there. Let's try and be positive in the second half, shall we? Give us some examples of innovation in social entrepreneurship, either in non-profits or in government that have struck you.
Yeah, so I think one really important example is community development finance and microfinance. So just creating financial services for folks who have traditionally been left out of the financial system, both within the U.S. and internationally. So a number of organizations, some not-profit, some for-profit, arose in the 70s. Designed one right here in the south side of Chicago, South Shore Bank, which was the first community development bank. And it just said, hey, we can create a set of innovative financial services for members of this poor community on South Shore, Chicago. And we can raise capital from folks who care about serving these communities, and we can treat the borrowers in a way that really supports them, and created great businesses, great social value from doing that.
Okay.
Another example is Khan Academy.
Right.
Khan Academy, in a space which is very much typically for government education, came up with how do we use, the technology of the internet in order to provide initially math lessons that can be really effective and can reach anybody in the world for free. And that's a really important social innovation. It's for a set of services that traditionally are mostly government services, but were done outside of the government sector.
Okay. So it can, although both the examples you gave are not government examples. Is there a government example of innovation?
Oh, yeah, sure. There are government examples, some good government examples that come out of research from economists, including economists here. So there's been a fair number of what are sometimes called nudge units created within governments around the world, where they're taking the insights from behavioral science research and applying it to a variety of government services to make them take up or compliance much more likely.
Right, a text message saying you haven't filed your taxes yet, get on with it, or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, so that sounds a little more hopeful. So we got some examples. What are they doing right? Because in the first half, you talked about all the things that stand in the way. So how are these or how are these efforts, initiatives, able to get around those constraints or eliminate them?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that have worked. They worked imperfectly. I think one thing that we see governments doing a lot is really outsourcing innovation. It's not coming from within their ranks. And there's sort of two ways that happens. One is organizations, social entrepreneurs, companies arise and create innovative software, let's say, and then they just sell them to government and say, hey, here's an innovative product that can allow you to do what you're trying to do more effectively, more efficiently, and please buy it from us. And that, there's a lot of that goes on. And sometimes governments say, hey, we don't know. We know we need to be able to use, AI to do X, whatever it might be. They say, I know we don't have the capabilities to do it, so let's contract with an outside organization. So that's kind of more traditional outsourcing, and get somebody to build this for us.
Is that a smart idea? Because is that kind of them knowing themselves and saying, we are not going to do this, but you can?
Right. So you could see, given the constraints, knowing the limitations, it's probably a good thing to do. But it's not necessarily great, especially very often with software where you need to be adapting it, or there are opportunities to adapt it over time. And having employees, having a staff that actually knows how to do that and knows we're there to build it can be really beneficial. The second thing is that government contracting also makes what we talked about earlier, which is the process of testing and iterating and learning, often is restricted through the way government contracting works, which is, here's what you have to do. There's an RFP. You have to do exactly this and deliver exactly this. And if you come up with opportunities to do it differently or do it better, there's can be no real way to make that happen.
Right. Okay. And presumably, what you're pointing to there is that there is not capacity being built to be innovative in the future if I'm always buying in innovation.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And I think we haven't talked that much about nonprofits, and I think the institutional barriers aren't as great. So I think there are lots of opportunities for large nonprofits to just decide they're going to be innovative, and they'll have to fundraise if they're philanthropy-based to be able to do that. But it seems more to me that it's missed opportunities.
Okay, well, let's talk about what they might do. How might nonprofits or governments do things differently?
One thing I'm intrigued about, an idea I've had for a while, is I'm always thinking about trying to draw analogies between the traditional for-profit sector and government or nonprofits. And there were these institutions, they didn't really work out that well, called corporate incubators, where rather than having an incubator or an accelerator program that was kind of like Y Combinator, would actually be sponsored by a corporation. They'd invest in the company, they'd support the startup, and then they'd have the ability to invest or have some business relationship or ownership of it down the road. And the problem with that is that the best entrepreneurs didn't like those restrictions, so they just went the traditional route. But if you think about somebody who has an idea, let's say, for doing some aspect of disaster relief more effectively, right? And it's going to be like, how do you start that thing? It's impossible, right? But if you could be incubated at the Red Cross, right, where they have like expertise, they have resources, they have a way for you to test and try it, and they have a way for you to scale it if it's successful, that would be enormously attractive. So I think in addition...
So this is just an idea.
This is an idea. There are a couple of places where I think they're starting to try to do something like this. But I think there are ways in which large nonprofits could say, we're going to try to be innovative, we're going to try to generate ideas internally, but we can also figure out ways, if again we have a culture that makes it challenging, to support innovation around the mission of the nonprofit more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Which sounds like a different way of doing what we talked about in the first half, which is setting aside a fund for this, or a unit that's going to be the innovation unit or fund.
Exactly. I think, again, dedicated resources are a critical piece of this.
Okay. You talked about scaling, because often I would imagine that somebody has an idea, it works on a very, very small scale. It's great, but how do you... What are the challenges involved in scaling a great idea?
The bottom line on government is it's a really big challenge to innovate, but scaling things that are working other places seems to be greater opportunity for government. And I think that also is somewhat broken. So if you think about some things like early childhood education, enormously valuable, maybe even positive NPV for government, right? We've known it for 20 or more years, and still, we're still debating it, right? So I think the actual adoption of things that have worked other places that we know work by government is also one of the biggest challenges. So innovation occurs, some city starts doing something better. Again, we talked, in the corporate sector in California, they're coming for me in Illinois, right? If it's the Palo Alto local government, Chicago's not worried that the Palo Alto government's going to come take over. So the incentives aren't so great. And I think the knowledge flows are surprisingly not that good. The number of times where people in parallel positions don't know what's going on in other places and don't know what's working. So I think there's also a real sort of opportunity, in addition to trying to be innovative, but to find innovations that have worked elsewhere and to think about how we get wider spread use of that.
Do you think that people get proprietary about that and say, well, that isn't a Chicago idea, or that's a California thing. It works there, it would never work here?
Well, it's really interesting. We taught a class for a while to think about trying to bring innovative nonprofits to Chicago as like the next place. And Chicago seems to have a reputation for people thinking, oh, if it wasn't built here, it's not going to work here. So lots of the organizations our student team started talking to said, I'm not really so excited about Chicago being the next place. Context obviously matters, right? So if you're thinking about not just pride of place, but if you actually think about, will it work in Chicago just because it's working somewhere else? Maybe not, but I think it's only by it's probably a good place to try. And it's only by scaling and trying to take things that work other places to really understand what about the context is most important and how can you adapt the innovation to work in other situations.
I mean, at the same time, we sort of, students of American government always hear that the states are sort of the experiment, the laboratories for policy. Is that not accurate in the real world?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. There's certainly, you can point to examples of it working, and I think it doesn't work nearly as well as it could. So this notion of we have 50 experiments going around, and that's like this really big value of a federalist system makes sense in theory. I think it doesn't deliver in practice as much as one might hope.
Okay. Now, Rob, there's been a specter in the background the whole time we've been talking, which is the specter of Elon Musk and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which, of course, is focused on some of the issues that you're talking about, not necessarily innovation for growth, but innovation for the sake of efficiency. And some of the things, I guess, that are part of that are trying to use. I mean, it's interesting, it's embedded, isn't it, within this unit of government set up, I believe, by Barack Obama to bring more tech into government departments. And so this idea of kind of being more efficient by using software, by using technology, DOGE isn't, as I say, it's not the first time that we've tried to address that problem. Now, I think what's probably different about DOGE is the shock and awe of it, and they're taking a sledgehammer to smash up. It kind of reminds me of when you have a contractor into your house, and the first thing they do is smash everything up. That's kind of the approach. Do you think is there any chance that will work? Will anything good come out of that?
Well, I think the sledgehammer to your house, I hope, was done after there were plans as to what to do to rebuild.
Correct.
And I think that's kind of the problem here, which is having a focus on government efficiency, or I would even prefer government effectiveness, is something that I think is an enormously important thing to be focused on. We've talked mostly about innovation, but even just trying to become more effective and more efficient, especially if it involves introducing new technology, is for many of the reasons we talked about. It's a hard, complex management challenge. And thinking about going about it just by firing people and eliminating all processes, and then trying to think that you can, hope that it'll just somehow create itself seems to me makes it seem really unlikely. So I've seen nothing so far which I would call a good idea about the rebuilding part. So I'm a skeptic.
Okay, so do you think it will work then? It sounds like you don't think it will work.
I don't think it'll work.
Okay, so...
But I think the one thing, I believe that sort of trying to expand, create greater government effectiveness, expand state capacity is one of the most important challenges for our society. And I think in part because of political horizons, it gets ignored. And, so, you're not going to see the payoff in 4 years or in 2 years. And my one modicum of hope is that what comes out of this, which I think will be a cost and a lot of disruption, and not a lot of benefits, is perhaps in a future administration, it'll get more attention.
That seems like a good place to wrap this conversation up. Thank you very much, Rob Gertner, for coming on the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
You're very welcome. It was fun having this chat.
That's it for this episode of the Chicago Booth Review podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. For more research, analysis, and insights, visit our website at chicagobooth.edu/review. When you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter so you never miss the latest in business-focused academic research. This episode was produced by Josh Stunkel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and please do leave us a 5-star review. Until next time, I'm Hal Weitzman. Thanks for listening.